Well, hello everyone, it's John Lockland. I'm the director of FVD International, Forum for Democracy International. Delighted to be with my usual co-host Peter Lavelle. Jeremy Nell will be joining us shortly, the other co-host from South Africa. And this week we are honoured and delighted to have Richard Sakwa, former professor of politics at the University of Kent in Canterbury in England, who has produced a book recently called The Lost Peace, which details the way in which the relations between the West and Russia unraveled and then crashed. I've got the book behind me. I should have got up and get it, but it's by my bedside behind me, Richard. But you were about to bring out another book, and that's the subject of our talk this afternoon: the culture of the new Cold War. This expression, new Cold War, you may not know this, but I edited a book called The New Cold War back in 2007. So we've been in the Cold War situation for some time. But what you say, I think, in your book, I haven't yet read it all, but I believe what you're writing about in this latest book is not the Cold War itself, not the relations with Russia, but instead what it says about the West, about the cancel culture, about the narrowing, the closing of the Western mind, to borrow a phrase from Alan Bloom. I think I'm right, Richard, in saying that you agree with me and with God knows how many other people, because I've lost count of the number of people who have said this to me, that the way I put it anyway, is that things that we used to associate with the old Soviet Union, intimidation for political reasons, professional intimidation, obviously limits on free speech and so on, all these things have in the last decade or so transmigrated to us in the West, and we are now living through, as former Czech President Václav Klaus said to me, we in Europe are now living through what Klaus, spent 47 of his years of his life living through. Is that your view as well, Richard?
Yes, in immediate term, there is this peculiar inversion where what was chased out through the front door, if you like, at the end of the first Cold War in 1989-91, has slipped in through the back door into the practices and the culture of what I call the political West. But the bigger issue, which you allude to, is that, why has this Cold War mentality persisted so consistently, despite all these enormous geopolitical and other changes, the collapse of the Soviet communist system, and so many global changes, the rise of the global South, the emergence of China as a major player. And yet we, the political West, that is, we in the West, remain absolutely committed to a form of competitive politics, to a form of engagement with others, which tries to ensure our own primacy. And at the same time, which denigrates the political choices and political subjectivity of the other. I just say one more word about this idea, then how do you explain it? And the way I'm now explaining it in this book and in the Lost Peace book is to argue that after 1945, this political beast emerged, which I call the political West. The Russians love to call it the collective West, but I wanted to give it more political features and specificity by calling it this political West. And this political West, which was shaped by the first Cold War, that is the huge security apparatus, the propaganda and agitprop at home. I mean, McCarthyism was an extreme version of it, but the way the CIA worked internally, FBI, and of course the National Endowment for Democracy from the early 80s, and so on. After the end of the Soviet Union, instead of dying out, if you like, which would have meant the end of this Cold War mentality, to move away from, if you like, competitiveness towards what Gorbachev wanted, which was, and I like to use this word nowadays, comity. C-O-M-I-T-Y,
yes.
This idea of comity, which is a cooperative relationship between states based on peace and development. It didn't happen after 1989, and instead of which we had this political West radicalized in all sorts of ways, which maintained, and that's why in 2007 you could talk about a new Cold War, because the first Cold War, in a certain profound sense, never ended. And then, of course, in 2014, we had the full-scale emergence of what I call the Second Cold War.
Before we go into the why, Richard, let's also, for the sake of our viewers, let's talk about the what. What is the culture of the new Cold War? Before we try to explain why it's come about, what is it? What are you identifying? Is it cancel culture? Is it the narrowing of? Is it the suffocating by ideology of critical thinking? What is the culture of the new Cold War for you?
There's a number of elements which feed into it, which make up this culture. Its specific features I'll mention in a second, but what is making it is threefold. I mean, the first is the one that you suggested, which is this extraordinary culture of wokeness and cancel culture, even though I mean, it's years ago we used to talk about political correctness. We don't use that word nowadays, but it's a continuation of a policing of the way that people think and behave, which from the start, some of those behaviors and some of that policing, I'm in favor of. Of course, we all are, even equality, inclusivity. But when they become an ideology, they become antithetical to their very essence. And that's the first thing. The second one is the culture is emerged from a sense of, if you like, civilizational entitlement of this political West, that it's, that the way we live is the way all the world should live. And while there was a socialist communist alternative, and indeed other alternatives, there are anti-colonial movements and all sorts of other things, and even religious movements, which had, global resonance, and indeed in the Vatican, Roman Catholicism, perhaps, all of these things, then it was it kept itself more in the box, if you like. Okay, but say this is good for us, and we'd like everybody else. After 1989, the end of the First Cold War, then it claimed a false universalism. And the third thing is the fact that it's substituting for what I call, what should be this impartial principles of the Charter, United Nations Charter of 1945. So it's in terms of international politics, it's substituting for what is genuinely international, that is the United Nations, in which China, Russia, Indonesia, Mexico, all the 193 states, what's nowadays called multipolarity, which is an essence of international affairs today, that comes into contradiction with the political West's claim to certain false universality, which generates all sorts of tensions. And then we can talk in future a bit, and actually how it works, including the death of diplomacy. That dialogue is a gift. You don't do it because you want to understand and engage with the other. It's a from a crown to the plebes out there in Mexico or whatever. We talk to you only if you deserve it, which is absolutely that arrogance.
What you're talking about is, in my mind, a continuity of a 500-year tradition. And we could compare the first Cold War and call it the second Cold War, but the word primacy has already been mentioned here. And primacy trumps anything else. It trumps values. It trumps. Primacy is an ideology in itself, and it will use whatever means necessary. Just like you said, to maintain primacy, there has to be a demand of a universal conception of man and civilization. I mean, it's much more cultural, and that's one of the reasons why John and I talk so much, because it's a cultural thing, a societal thing, and it is often just deemed a political thing. And I would like to point out, before you answer, is that one of the things I find very interesting living in Moscow is that the animosity that comes from the political West against Russia is not reciprocated. It's still not reciprocated.
No, it isn't. No, absolutely not. No, I mean, you raise a fundamental question there, Peter. So the way I'm now conceptualizing it is that this political West is a beast which, obviously with deep roots in Wilsonian idealism of at the end of the First World War and so on. But basically, it took shape in terms of NATO, in terms of economic order.
That's the expression of it. That's the
after 1945, this shaped in the political West. However, what you allude to is something else, which I nowadays call the civilizational West. Its 500-year dominance. My friend Alan Freeman, for example, calls it the Columbian West. Once we, from 1492, and then it led on to the civilizational West, going global with Vasco da Gama and so on in Asia, and of course the destruction of the Aztecs, Incas, and the native peoples, and so on. We all know that, but also accompanied by the civilizational West. This is what of course Samuel Huntington was alluding to in his early 1990s works on the clash of civilizations. But so it's different. The political West is a particular manifestation of this larger civilizational West. But what we're seeing today is the intersection of this 500-year cycle and this 80-year cycle, and that's what makes it particularly potent. And can I just say one other thing? Underlying it, which is your final point, which is that when you say Russians don't have animosity, because Russians are part of this third West, what I call now the cultural Europe. This is the one with the Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman, and of course, at its very birth in the Axial Age, it was deeply connected with the Sinaic civilizations, the Indian or Indus civilizations. So, and that's what Russia today is inherently, it doesn't need to apply, it is part of this cultural Europe. It is an Orthodox Christian country, obviously with Islam, with Buddhism and Judaism and so many others, which adds to its color and adds to its depth of that civilizational Europe, because cultural Europe by its essence is not closed. It is always open. And that precisely reflects the Russian vision, Solovyov-like, of its openness and so on. And that's why one reason to explain why Russians today, all the way from, well, I was going to say Brest-Litovsk, from Belarus, but Vladivostok, have this cultural sense that it's the West has abandoned them rather than them having turned away from the West, because the West, and that's when you come to those excesses and saying, oh, the West is all of this sort of gay Europa and so on, language I do not like, and I think it denigrates and undermines the cultural depth and profundity of Russia. But that's the dilemma, and that's why Russians do not have this animosity. It's more bewilderment than anything else, isn't it?
And
Richard,
if I could reply to Peter's question, which I think is a very good one. Yes, of course, Europe has had a sense of superiority for 500 years, but you only have to go back to the period we're talking about, so like say 30 years ago or a little bit more, to recall times, and those times lasted for many centuries, when there was very substantial disagreement within individual countries about foreign policy. So obviously in France, you had the whole Gaullist episode. He was opposed, as we know, by European federalists. In Britain, prior to that, you had the whole Churchill-Chamberlain opposition. In the 19th century, you had Disraeli and Gladstone. And of course, in the 60s and 70s, you had within the United States, huge opposition between pro and anti-Vietnam War people. So the phenomenon that Richard is talking about, I'm not sure if my connection is holding, is indeed a very recent one.
Jeremy, you want to jump in?
Go ahead, Jam. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I was cutting out there.
No, it's good. You're good.
No, you're fine. Richard, it's been a couple of years since you and I spoke, and it's great to chat to you again. You were talking about the political West and the civilizational West. Is there a cultural West? I'm thinking now to when Trump became president, and he actually announced that there are two genders, and that for me is bewildering. How the president of the United States has to say that, and I kind of see that as an absolute sham of where things are going.
Yeah, I did talk indeed about this cultural Europe, which is just like, but yeah, you're absolutely right. This Trump phenomenon, many people are now accusing me, they're saying, Richard, you talk about this political West, and just like the Owl of Minerva, just at the time when the political West is being savaged by Donald J. Trump in the return thereof. But what is interesting in all of that, and the fact that he's articulating it in precisely that way, and that extraordinary inauguration speech, and so many other elements within that, that it takes such a flawed instrument to articulate so many important points, that what Trump is saying is so important in all sorts of ways, including questioning the militarism and the violence at the heart of this political West, because when he says, that against war, I mean, that was so, an extraordinary statement. And of course, Marco Rubio, for example, who's now been accepted by the Senate as Secretary of State, in his nomination discussion with the Senate committee, he also talked and repeated these things about peace. Now, we in Europe have not heard the word peace for 4 years. The European Union doesn't even know how to spell it. And of course, the European Union has now become an instrument for the perpetuation of war and conflict, rather than we used to believe that it was a peace project. So, and as for the gender issue, yep, I mean, in that speech, there was so much to criticize as well, of course, the repudiation of, in my view, I'm a great believer in, as I said, charter internationalism based on the United Nations. And that would mean, of course, support for the World Health Organization, support for United Nations, UNRWA in Gaza, Palestine more broadly, and so many other things. And of course, a consciousness of the environmental issues, which I think Trump doesn't have. So he's gone to excess. He's gone to another extreme, if you like, another excess, and that's where we're trapped. Which means why it's so important for people like us, if I may say so, to try to forge a sort of a path which would accept the critique that the political West, with its culture, has gone far too far in all sorts of ways. Yet, on the other hand, we need a responsible policy in health issues and environmental issues towards, to articulate a peace and development agenda, which is sustainable, inclusive. So those words should not be stolen from us. They're, we want those things, but we want them in a sensible manner, common sense, as he put it.
Sorry, John, before you jump in, I just want to ask a continuation, Richard. Is politics upstream from culture, or is culture upstream from politics?
Yeah, excellent. I like that. We used to talk, these are our, for many years, which I enjoyed very much, first year politics classes at the university. And that's a sort of issue which we would really have lovely discussions about. And of course, the cop-out, but which is what I do believe, is that it's both, because culture and politics are deeply, I don't like this word, but it comes to my mind, imbricated, deeply connected. But more, and that's precisely what I've been arguing for, which is, a culture of dialogue. In politics, in my view, is all about a substantive, dialogue, a la, the word, we're talking about dialogism from Bakhtin and his studies of Dostoevsky. And as we know in Dostoevsky novels, they talk, and then they talk some more, and then they talk yet another few hours more. But at the end of it, as Bakhtin pointed out, everyone has changed. And that is my view of politics, that politics is about dialogue, genuine, substantive political dialogue, in which we all learn, and in which we all then, at the end of it, it isn't me to bash you over the head or you to do vice versa, but it is to have to come a deeper understanding, not just of political solutions, but of how to achieve it, so that we can build a consensus, a substantive consensus. Yeah, but I think it goes back to Platonic Athens.
I agree with Jeremy. I mean, having the president of the United States saying there's two genders, I mean, that's kind of a wake-up call of how far things have gone. Very good point here. But we do have an embedded tradition, and it's institutionalized. I mean, we'll see what Trump can do. The jury's out for me, okay, because he was already president. But how do you re-legitimize speech that has been delegitimized? I mean, how do you get over that? Because in foreign policy terms, anytime there's the word diplomacy is mentioned, it's Munich all over again. I mean, how do we get past that? How do you unring those bells? Because Putin has been called Hitler. How do you sit down and talk to Hitler? I mean, this is why I find it so depressing. Okay. Because before the end of our talk here, I'd like to ask you for the solution to the problem in Ukraine. But the point is that how do you get to where you want to go? I agree with you. I think all of us agree with you. But how do we get there?
Yeah, yeah. So just one word about the first Trump. The fact that the first Trump presidency, I think, is obviously going to be very different from the second, because in the first one he was on a back foot from the very beginning, and deliberately so, of course, with the Russiagate allegations, and therefore he was trapped, and therefore he had to bend a stick, all the way the other way, and show just how militant he was and how tough he was, even though, for example, even the bombing of Syria, Shan Hakum, in April 2017, which he did it, he warned the Russians and so on, he did the minimum. But then people like Farid Zakaria, I think it was, would it be CNN? He then said, finally, when he used some bombs, he's now finally a president. That sort of attitude is so bizarre. Using weapons and power is such like the second presidency, in economic terms, clearly is such like. But as you say, for some people, it's always 1938. They seem to have got stuck in politics at that moment. And how do we then overcome it? Well, I mean, I like the title of this very discussion, The Forum. That's exactly it. It's a platform for dialogue, and obviously going back to Athenian dialogism. So how do we overcome it? It's tough. I mean, because we've all in one way or another have been cancelled and been limited in one way or another. But the only thing to do is to first of all, to work out our own positions politically, philosophically, even, and culturally, and say no. There must be negotiation. There must be dialogue. There must be such like. More than that, this is the big issue of our times, and sometimes I describe it as the void. What do I mean by the void? Political. I mean, this is a term many used it, but Peter Meer, way back, well over a decade ago, when he talks about the collapse of the old-fashioned political parties. Because in the old days, we would work through a political party. We'd have a socialist party, or even work within the Conservative Party, whatever equivalents on the continent and in elsewhere. But political parties now, I mean, are shadows and as forms of political mobilization. Trade unions, peace movements, of course, they still exist. We have in the United Kingdom, as you know, Stop the War Coalition. We've got a very active group in Canterbury, but which is excellent, with lots of interesting discussions. But where's that societal input? And one has to say that and church organizations and so much else. That this void, it's a void in organizational terms, in associational terms, and even ideological terms, because there's a massive, can I just say that people are not apathetic. They're not apathetic. You talk to anybody in the Dog and Duck when you go for a pint and so on, they're happy to talk, and I do it all the time. We have our local pub, the Unicorn, which is, I say, the other major seat of learning in my town of country. So everybody engages, but so just to finish, it's not apathy, it's disengagement, which is something totally different.
Yeah, but hasn't the void been engineered by those that have power? They've done this intentionally. It's not because of apathy. You're absolutely right. That's why this void, it has this. Because of this void, we're having this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. That's excellent. And for example, one example would be our dear old Labour Party in the United Kingdom, when you did have, it was repoliticized under Jeremy Corbyn. You may criticize him for all sorts of reasons, but in that time, the Labour Party suddenly became engaged in politics again, and 500,000 people. Party didn't join, but nearly 500,000 joined, and associate members. Enormous political discussion, and just shows you this hunger. And I actually believe that there is a huge hunger out there for people to articulate what we're talking about, which is a peace, development, negotiating, humane approach, which is beyond the politics of, how can I put it, the narrow politics of identity politics, let's put it this way.
Well, the Bernie Sanders movement would be the equivalent of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I'm struck, Richard, by your account of the Trump inaugural speech, which shocked you and no doubt many other people in many respects. But you didn't mention what to me was the most shocking. I mean, I wasn't morally shocked, but objectively, it's the most shocking. statement, which is that he undertook in his inaugural speech to increase the territory of the United States of America. Yeah. And you're a supporter of the United Nations Charter. I don't need to tell you that that's more or less what the Charter was written to prevent. But to come back to what Jam said about culture and politics, I don't know what you think of my view. Glenn Deason recently yesterday actually wrote a Substack which is very, very close to what I think. Namely that the collective West, you can't distinguish the cultural wars from the political wars, because the collective West institutionally for the last 30 years has been based on ideology. And by ideology, I don't just mean one or other ideology. What I mean is it's been based on a voluntaristic determination embodied on the one side of the Atlantic by the neocon establishment and on the other side by the European Union to create artificial realities, to create reality or to pretend to create reality. There's a very famous exchange, I expect you know it, which Ron Suskind talks about in the White House with an unnamed official, probably Karl Rove, where Karl Rove says, you journalists, you're just running behind writing things down. We, the empire, we are creating reality. You're in the, and he says to him condescendingly, you're in the reality-based community, but we are the creators of reality. And similarly, on the European side, we are, of course, involved since the end of the Cold War in the creation of this post-modern, post-historical entity, the European Union, which is also the sort of creation of an illusion, creation of an artificial reality. And then by extension, other adventures in foreign policy, Kosovo, Bosnia, and ultimately also Ukraine. They're also all about creating, in my opinion, fictitious realities, which in fact, of course, go against reality. And the gender movement, the transgender movement seems to me to be only the latest declension of that. You may not be completely in agreement with me on this, Richard, but I'd be pleased to hear your reaction.
No, I think that I think one of the sections in the culture of the Second Cold War is reality wars. It's and what is so astonishing is that they're incommensurate in so profound a way. Is that if one is stuck in one reality, one cannot see the other one, and vice versa. And that's what makes it so frightening. That's why there can be no dialogue, and that's why it's always 1938.
And Ukraine from 2014 onwards, and perhaps before, was an example of these parallel universes that never engaged.
Yes, and also the other point you make about the European Union as being post-historical, that opens up a whole interesting dialogue and debate about this. The very idea of being post-historical a la Fukuyama is so astonishingly gnostic in the profound sense, in a sense that they have access to some arcane or esoteric knowledge, which is only privileged to them, vouchsafed to them. No one else has got it. And because they're so privileged, everybody else, of course, is, as Borrell put it, they're in the jungle and we're in that garden of knowledge. So,
Richard,
sets up all sorts of oppositions, in other words.
In terms of the political West, John is in Europe and Peter's in Russia. I'm in Africa. I'm in South Africa. So we're part of BRICS. Where do we fit in your view, let's say in the next 25 years?
Yeah. Two things. This political West, of course, is another reason why I use it. It's not simply constrained geographically, of course, and it would Canada and New Zealand, Australia, and of course those alliances, South Korea, Japan, etc. First, second, BRICS. What we are seeing now, I talk about this political West. I think we are seeing the emergence of, good old Marxists or Hegelians would talk about contradiction and the importance of contradiction. And one of them is clearly that you have the emergence of, and what I've written in the last piece about the emergence, for convenience, calling it the political East. Now, my argument about the political East, including BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, by the way, on the BRICS. A few days ago, Indonesia joined, which was absolutely,
incredible.
it's mind-blowing, enormity of it, the most
The
populous.
biggest Muslim nation in the world.
Absolutely, all sorts of things associated with that, and that they've gone in fully fledged is not just as a partner. So it's now 10 full members of BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so much else. Let's call it, for convenience, leaving aside the global South issue, the political East. Now, my argument is that we are seeing the emergence, just by definition, including economically, because the exorbitant privilege of dollar supremacy for so long has been so abused and used instrumentally in terms of sanctions, etc. That's another thing from the speech about using the dollar, and that he was going to have many tariffs on those who try to establish alternatives. But a political East, and my key point is this: they're not anti-Western, they're post-Western. It's a counter.
Yeah.
It's something which is transcending it and saying, look, we don't like your games, your bloc politics, your attempts to extend NATO to East Asia.
It's a world beyond the West.
Yes, in both geographical, ideological, and in a sense, ideology in a sense John used it earlier, which is just a set of ideas, and so on. So where South Africa fits in, and there's a third element where it's one of the core parts, but I would say something even more than that is that South Africa is the voice of a huge rising continent in all sorts of ways, and that. I don't know. I'm sure there's plenty of debates within South Africa about genuine how to move beyond post-colonial societies. Obviously, 50, 60 years later, it's no good talking about all our problems come from colonialism. A lot of them do, I'm sure. And they do, of course they do. But ultimately, the decisions which are taken by countries like South Africa, Kenya, and so many others, and that really that Africa, those old slogans we used to talk about, awake Africa and so on, as Kipling-esque talks. But in a sense, there's something to it, that Africa has got to take control of its own destiny and is responsible for itself. And the same goes for South Africa. It's got a huge and difficult legacy, but it's got huge bounty as well. And it really has to make sure. And of course, people so easily write off what the enormous divisions and inequalities within South Africa, but it's marvelous that is part of the BRICS, because it's something bigger, and BRICS can then help feed in with the new development bank and so on for the development of South Africa.
No, but are you suggesting that the political East will become the sort of African ally, so to speak?
Well, as many South Africa is part of it, so it's not an African ally. This is where, again, that thinking of the political West, always divisive. Either you're for us or against us. Mm-hmm. And that's precisely a logic of comity which I reject. That, of course, all the African countries should have only one thing in mind: their own national interest, how best they can develop and take advantage of everything, and not to become playthings of geopolitical contestation. And so even the idea of playing off China against the United States, against Russia, that of course is, that's the way they like to do it in Washington and London. But that's not and I'm sure elsewhere as well. And to be trapped again in the sterility of so-called great games and so on. No, we need to move beyond that.
Well,
there is
speaking
actually,
of
I think, a sense in BRICS. Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
No, please, John.
There is a sense in BRICS, I think, that they need to get out of that, which is an encouraging sign. I went to a conference on BRICS in Sochi in November, and they were very insistent there that BRICS would not have any kind of central secretariat, and still less central control, such as in, for instance, the European Union. And much as in the Eurasian Economic Union, there's a big emphasis in those organizations on national sovereignty and on the lightness of the structure. In other words, on the alterity, Richard, that you put so much, and on the comity that you put so much emphasis on.
Can I just say one thing on that? That You're absolutely right. But BRICS and some of the others, they are developing the way I would have liked to have seen European integration develop. And that's the way that David Mitriani talked about it. In other words, functionalist. Let's get together to facilitate trade, electricity transfers, educational transfers. That's functional, specific things. We build trust. We're building a new political community, not some bounded territory to we're in, you're out, we're garden, your jungle, all of that sort of talk. So you're absolutely right. And those people working within BRICS, I've heard it so many times, are talking along those lines. Again, not to be anti, but to be counter the logic of conflict.
Do you want to follow up?
No, go ahead, Peter.
Okay. John mentioned Greenland.
Oh, yes.
And I thought that well, I think it's going to turn into an interesting metaphor for the next few years, because I think all of us would agree that we've all lamented that there has been a lack of realism, a la Mearsheimer, Jeffrey Sachs, people like that, Glenn Deason even. And it seemed to me, going back to one of the first things Richard mentioned is primacy, is that, we could be entering a world that where being realist is just another neocolonial endeavor, but it serves the same purposes. I mean, this neoliberal ideology is very malleable, and why can't neoliberalism be realist? Which seems kind of contradictory, but Trump has seemed to kind of bending that arc of history here. Because the same values, oh, sure, there are two genders. Okay, great. We all knew that anyway. Okay. I'm just very skeptical of this because, we see this neoliberal model is just being purely ideological, but it actually can be very real in physical, in reality. I mean, if Donald Trump is determined, he will get Greenland, he will get Panama, and who knows what will happen to Canada. What I'm just saying here is that there's still this primacy that is motivating it. This is the center. It is power, and it's being able to exert itself, and it will take whatever ideological bent that is available and palatable. I mean, Donald Trump says America's going to get bigger. Well, a lot of people in the MAGA movement say, "What's wrong with that?"
Yeah. What Trump has done is he has taken down the curtain. He has stripped the veil of a power system which has been doing that in one way or another, in different ways, since 1945. I mean, the CIA and other in the United States in the first Cold War had 54 interventions, Guatemala, Iran, etc., and so on. So, but what he's done is made he's now, and also, by the way, that the mysticism or the mystique of the post-war economic system, which has been a huge pump, sucking resources both in the colonial times and the neo-colonial forms, as a recent Oxfam report last week showed, that every hour, $38 million are being sucked out from what Jeremy was talking about, the global south, in forms of debt repayments to the global north. And I don't go along with a lot in that Oxfam report, but some of the statements are striking. But indeed, can I just say this realism idealism thing, that that's sometimes Trump is neither. He's just an old-fashioned power, as you say, broker, But we have the realists, as you say, the Mearsheimer sorts and so on, which is great because they look at the world as it is and not as it should be. The liberals, of course, were always profoundly based, this liberal imperialism back from John Stuart Mill from the mid-19th century all the way onwards to the liberal interventionists in the post-Cold War years. It's always been double standards. We'll biff those we don't like and we'll give a free pass to those who are our friends, even if they're doing exactly the same as those whom we've now condemned for the same thing. But so this sort of liberal internationalist so-called idealism, but but there's a third school. I mean, not just ethics and so on, but it would be what I'd say the norm-based world. That is the ones which maybe they don't achieve it, but this is what's important about the BRICS and others, as John would have seen as well. They constantly appeal to the UN Charter and those Charter principles,
Yeah.
because we know that they are more honored in the breach than anything else. Yet, nevertheless, it provides the framework in international affairs from what is legitimate, what is, has the role of international law. And of course, it gives the framework for genuine multilateralism to solve those problems facing humanity. And so between realism and idealism, there is this normativism, if you like, which charterism, which I now more and more wish to articulate as a way which is realist. Yes, we look at the world. We do have ideals. We do have ideas. We have an ethical vision.
Yeah, like we won't support slavery. Yeah.
Well, we won't support economic exploitation either. That there has to be a global justice of one form or another, and that comes back to
genocide. Okay, things.
Oh, and indeed, yes. And of course, when he talks about Greenland, he's not talking about, I hope not invading, but buying it, that's a slightly different thing. So if it can be negotiated, the greatest deal since Alaska, the purchase of Alaska.
Yeah. Richard, gentlemen, I'd like to, I'm looking at the clock here. I'd like to at least reserve at least 10 minutes to ask Richard about Ukraine. Another 10 minutes of theory is okay, but he's written the best book on it, so I need to know what he thinks now. Okay.
But I just want to jump in with a question before you go to Ukraine. Richard, you were chatting. This idea of Greenland is ridiculous. But Trump made a comment that we haven't spoken about that I suspect is very dangerous, and I think we'll all agree that his comment about Taiwan is very, very worrying. What do you think this means for the future in terms of the political West, political East, and of course China? I mean, the Cold War was effectively Russia, but I mean that's shifting towards China.
Yeah, no, in the Second Cold War, there's two major axes. There's the traditional Washington-Moscow one. It was implicit in the First Cold War, but it's much more articulated now. And that is what will become the main one, which is Washington-Beijing. And then how they manage their relationship in East Asia and the South China Sea. And as you say about Taiwan, it's fundamentally explosive, potentially. Biden, of course, four times, even though allegedly he was an expert in foreign policy, 50 years in it, though a more cack-handed manager of foreign policy, I think, has seldom been seen. But he four times repudiated what the United States itself has signed up to, which is one China and this strategic ambiguity, which I thought was sensible, because the last thing we want to see, again, first of all, peaceful, no militaristic intervention, and of course for Taiwan and China to be able to live and work together, maybe some sort of overarching community. And as it was, I've been to Beijing many times, and you have a special channel for Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and that's fine. Let them work it out themselves. But this pernicious and perfidious intervention from Washington and some European capitals, all they're doing is adding fuel to a fire. And when they encourage this independentist movement, which is contested within Taiwan, of course, very profoundly, but when they give encouragement to what I consider, a dangerous trend, because they themselves, of course, were in favor of one China, but they were saying that they were the real China, of course.
But Richard, since Taiwan has been brought up, again, the contradictions become so apparent in the current, very young and new administration, that, well, if Trump is going to snatch up Greenland, snatch up Taiwan, then why can't Russia snatch up Ukraine? I mean,
that is, I think, what may happen. Dmitry Peskov more or less said that when he reacted to the Greenland comments. Before we go on to Ukraine, and I'm conscious that Peter would like to, and indeed so would I, can I just make one remark about the Charter, Richard, in the context of the Greenland thing, in the context of what you said about the 54 interventions during the Cold War, and of course the economic system. Surely the difference between the proposal to acquire Greenland and thereby to increase American territory, surely it is a very substantial paradigm shift, because previously American power was, as you say, operated behind a veil which you said he's just pulled down. But the veil was very important, ideologically very important.
Yes.
And if instead now the American territory is increased, the territory of the American state is increased, then surely we are going towards or back to an international system based on states, just as when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, if Russia had done a Kosovo and created an autonomous Republic of Crimea rather than annexing it, I'm sure the Western reaction would have been less vehement. And in the light of that, do you not agree? We've talked about values and so on, but the core issue in the United Nations Charter is surely the primacy of statehood, the sovereign equality of states, and the rule of non-interference. All the values and so on, they come later.
They do. But the fundamental principle at the heart of the United Nations is that Westphalian principle, which you've just put up, the 1648 one. But it's balanced, yes. It's sovereignty, but it's also internationalism. So the United Nations Charter system walks on two legs, and by multilateralism, it's we work together for peace, we work together for development, post decolonization, and so on. But you're right in the sense that, of course, we can compare Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which Russia simply recognized as their independence, which didn't get much traction either, by the way.
Exactly.
But you're right. I think that the Charter international system is under greater threat today than it has been in the 80 years since its foundation, that it's being eroded quite explicitly. Both Ukraine and Israel explicitly denigrate, and obviously all the resolutions, UN General Assembly resolutions on a Palestinian state, two-state solution, and so on and so forth. And they're openly flouting it. And the United States, Trump, of course, has got absolutely no time for either the sovereign internationalism at the heart of the UN system or the democratic internationalism of those liberal internationalists. And it is back to a more raw, unmediated, power-based thing. The state has always been central, but this is of the aggrandizing state. In addition, by double standards, a single standard, which is not a very nice one.
Yeah, but an extension to John's point is that during the first Cold War, there was a concerted effort on part of the West, and particularly the United States, is to be able to control international institutions. The ebbs and flows of criticizing the United Nations, that's part of American political culture. But now we see the abandonment of the ICC, the ICJ. These institutions are an impediment, and there's almost kind of a rejection of that. I am always for these institutions because it gives smaller countries, and the smallest countries, a sense of being on an equal playing field, where they have representation within the international system. But this whole Greenland thing brings up the point of what John is saying, the primacy of the state again, and the abandonment by the West of many of these institutions. In many ways, and maybe this is hyperbole, but the powers that be are acting more and more like the second half of the 20th century didn't happen.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing on that Trump is the most extreme example of it. But over the last few years, I've been equally disturbed by the way that the European Union leaders, and especially under the influence of this new so-called new Eastern, we're seeing the East Europeanization of the European Union, which instead of transcending the logic of conflict, they've got genuine issues over the historical record with the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. But instead of working them through, they've now, those tensions and those grievances are being magnified and weaponized, I hate the word, within the European Union. Just look at the language of Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and Kubilius, and those the leader. I was going to use the word the gang at the head of the European Union today. I mean, it's frightening. It says Ursula von der Leyen, when they talk about Russia, it is a total dehumanization of a country of 150 million people. You can criticize it, as long as you like, but do it in a way. And of course, then talk about, how do we come to terms and understand, empathy is not the same as sympathy, but there's no language. And that's so Trump has its counterpart, what we've been doing in Brussels for the last few years. And that's
And those
frightening. That's
people,
even more
and tho-
frightening.
and those people, I'm thinking of particularly of Kaya Kallas, but I'm sure it's unspoken in many of the others. They goes back to what I said about inventing or creating reality.
Yeah.
So they imagine that these 150 million people can be made to disappear. It's the biggest
Yes.
country in Europe, for
Well,
God's sake. And
John,
yet
you
they
had
are,
the Finnish foreign minister this week, I think, saying Russia needs to be broken up.
yes, exactly. And Kaya Kallas has said it and so on.
Yeah.
Anyway,
The
that all brings us
decolonization of Russia
onto
ideology.
Ukraine, Peter. What do you want to ask Richard about Ukraine?
Well,
Go ahead.
Richard, since we're rapidly running out of time, and given your vast knowledge, how is the Ukraine problem going to be resolved? You have 10 minutes.
Yes, I was going to say that I'm a political scientist, not an astrologer, so it's that's a good one. But how is it likely to play out? I don't know. But what one can say, what are the principles underlying it? And I think that the one which has been coming out from Moscow in the last few weeks after Trump's interventions of one form or another, and indeed the speeches in Davos last week, and so when Russia and others say that. That there are three interlocking elements, and it's like a Rubik cube, and to get them all lined up is really very hard. But to start from the biggest one, clearly we're talking about the one which is on the agenda now, US-Moscow relations. So global politics, including and boiling away underneath it, there is of course the largest strategic arms control issue. Yesterday, the bulletin of atomic scientists moved the doomsday clock 1 second closer to the apocalypse. So we're now 89 seconds. It's symbolic, but it's important shift towards it. And of course, in 2026, the New START treaty comes to an end. So there's a huge agenda in which Ukraine is marginal to all of that. It's an irritating factor, but that's really the fate of humanity depends on it. And of course, with the involvement of possibly China and some larger strategic stability talks. So we're not talking about disarmament. We're talking about arms control. We're talking about some sort of dialogue at this stage. That's so important. The second wheel, if you like, in all of this is the European level one, and one which I've been particularly, and I know John has, and we all have been particularly involved in, and that is the level of European security. That this is what this war, in my view, has always been about. For many years, 30 odd years, people have said to me, in the early years, why do I have this sort of sense of optimism? And and then I'd answer in the quiet moments. I'd say, look, it isn't optimism. It's just that the worst that I fear will happen hasn't happened so far. So that was because it was quite obvious at the end of the Cold War that, and again, John did this book as it worked in 2007, talking about New Cold War, that none of the fundamental questions of European security had been resolved at the end of the First Cold War. And therefore, those issues were bubbling away. About German unification, again, was not a solution. Fantastic for Germany, and we're very happy. But it's, it didn't solve it. In fact, just exacerbated it, because that larger question of balance and the Bismarckian question: what is the secret of a good of peace, of European security? A good treaty with Russia. That they didn't do it. And of course, by the way, more and more evidence comes out now. And it's Zubok in his book Collapse shows it, that Washington, and it's in my Lost Peace book as well, that right from the beginning there was no attempt, and in fact quite explicit attempt, not to include Russia, because Russia was not going to be allowed into the political West. That's why I think this concept works, because Russia thought it could join the West because it was an amorphous West. Unfortunately, what it failed to understand is that the West had taken a political form, which was a very hard shell, and in which the United States and its allies, and you could call them nastier things within that, some people call them vassals and so on, but that thing, and obviously if Russia joined it, then the whole balance and the whole thing would change, that it would mean the end of the political West, and it would mean a different dynamic entirely. And Washington, from the beginning, was never willing to do that. And Jeffrey Sachs shows that, and so many others do. So that's a second level. And that's, we have to, before, and then we come to Ukraine itself. And there's one important question, that within Ukraine, there has to be, and this is Nikolai Petro and other works on this, that they have to have, re-envision and Vladimir Ishchenko, fantastic scholar. Again,
Yeah.
they're saying that and Olga Baisha, so many more. We're talking about people who are Ukrainians who are saying that there has to be a rethinking of the Ukrainian political community, and there will be no peace unless they do it.
Even Ukrainian identity. That's what.
Oh,
That's
indeed.
right.
Indeed, exactly, very much so. All of that has to be, so they have to rethink it. Only, there's three big wheels there, and then of course the immediate sense of how can we stop the fighting, how can we stop the war, has to be, all three levers or wheels have to be engaged at the same time. Maybe not, none of them are going to be resolved, but a process which engages all three issues is the way forwards. And of course, I think, as listening to Marco Rubio's speech, which was actually quite good, to be honest, the nomination speech or discussions, it showed, I never, I obviously know who he was, never followed him so closely before, and he was saying, surprisingly, apart from on China, when it comes to Europe, he was saying sensible things, which was a bit more.
I saw the same hearings, and I think you could draw a different conclusion. Is what I think he's speaking, obviously, on the behalf of Donald Trump, is that peace is the goal. They want to end wars, but they don't know how to resolve the core issues. And what I fear, and I feel like I'm in a minority, maybe in a couple of weeks, people will acknowledge my position, is that escalation is always a possibility, and it's always a default position. And I still very much worry about that, because the Ukraine debate, if we want to call that in the West, it's groupthink. I mean, first we have to do is get a cessation of hostilities. We need a ceasefire and all that. They're not listening to the Russians. They've said over and over and over again how they want to approach this. They're not listening, and listening again is an admission that we're in 1938. I'm sorry for being so pessimistic here.
On that point, you're absolutely right.
Go ahead.
If they think that they can escalate to de-escalate, the Trumpian thinking, as some have heard, then we're heading for doomsday, because it'll not be escalate to de-escalate, it'll be escalate for escalation. And then, of course, as we said, the nuclear issue is always there in the background on all sides, by the way. So it's so as you say, we have to have some diplomacy, and so you're absolutely right. There's that danger, but hopefully that Trump unleashed, freed from Russiagate, could actually finally talk to Putin, and finally we're looking forward to that discussion, as he's had quite good discussion so far with Xi Jinping. And of course, Xi Jinping then telephoned Putin, and they had a long discussion just a few days afterwards, the 21st, which was fascinating. That Trump and Xi Jinping spoke on the 17th of January, the 21st, Xi Jinping telephones, with Moscow, and they have a 1.5 hour discussion. So we need now that third part of the triangle is Trump talking to Putin, and who knows?
Well, I think that will happen. That was essentially your first of your three levels, wasn't it, Richard?
Yeah. Yes.
And I think that will happen, and we're all expecting that. I must say, listening to you does make me feel rather pessimistic because of your second level, your second point about collective European security, because nobody, as far as I can tell, is thinking about that, except the Russians, of course, who keep on asking for it, and who will be making new proposals for yet again new proposals. This has been going on for more than 100 years, by the way. It long predates the Soviet experience. But as you've said earlier, Richard, and this point is perhaps the point on which to finish, when we look at the European leaders, it seems to me that nobody at all in Europe is giving thought to collective security.
Apart from Viktor Orban, perhaps, and Robert Fico in Slovakia, and some of the other political leaders, as in Holland. Yeah,
but of course the opposition to any such proposals will be
Indeed.
Immense. Richard, It's been such a pleasure. We could go on for hours, but we like to stick to the time of 1 hour. We'd be delighted if you'd come back. You're always welcome, and thank you very much indeed for giving us your time.
It's been my pleasure.
Sakwa,
Thank you, Richard.
It's been an honor. Thank you everyone for watching, and we look forward to welcoming you again at the same time next week. All the best. Goodbye.